This is the Permaculture Podcast. I'm Scott Mann. This episode is another new interview recorded by the show's co-hosts, Mary Marshall and Andrew Tuttle. This time they sit down with Jude Hobbs of Cascadia Permaculture to talk about functional hedgerows. During this conversation, Jude starts with her background in horticulture and permaculture beginning in the 1980s, including her interest in holistic landscape management, becoming a permaculture instructor, and her first publication on hedgerows. Mary and Andrew then lead Jude through a conversation on what it means to create, design, and grow a functional hedgerow. For permaculture practitioners, this is an important conversation. As hedgerows open up a design niche you can explore that helps farmers increase their biodiversity while providing you and them with additional income. To ease this transition, Jude, Mary, and Andrew discuss programs and organizations helping with funding these efforts. Enjoy this conversation with Jude, Mary, and Andrew, and I'll join you again after.
Welcome to the Permaculture Podcast. My name is Andrew Tuttle with the Permaculture Podcast and Edge Perma.
And I'm the co-host and co-creator of Edge Perma, and my name is Mary Marshall.
And today we're here with Jude Hobbs. We're thrilled to have this conversation all on hedgerows and all of the permaculture work that Jude does. Jude, could you please give us a little bit about your background and your work in permaculture?
Oh, yes, I'd be delighted to. And thank you for inviting me on the show. I started working with the land basically in the early 80s. I purchased my roommate's landscape design and maintenance business. And I put up my shingle for Cascadia Landscape Design and started that process of kind of learning on the ground about design and maintenance, and decided I wanted to go to horticulture school, and I focused on design. And then in 1984, I heard about a workshop with Roz Greasy, Robert Keurig, and Kate Gesser on edible landscaping. That totally changed the direction of my business, focused predominantly on native plants and food plants. And then in 1985, I was invited to go to Whidbey Island to learn about permaculture, which I had not heard about previously. And there was about 12 of us there who did a crash course in 5 days. And of course, that totally redirected my life. And I've been practicing and teaching permaculture pretty much ever since then, including it in my businesses, in the design business. And then I started teaching my first PDC course in 1990 and my first permaculture teacher training in 2001. So, simultaneously, I'm doing the landscape design business probably for 15 or more years. And then I decided I wanted to start working with farmers and looking at their management practices and assessing, thinking of whole systems, which is one of the things that I love about permaculture. And I started working with an organization called Salmon Safe, and in that process was guiding farmers to encourage biodiversity, worked on watershed management, erosion control, and bringing hedgerows into that environment as well. And in 1998, Oregon State University asked me to do a publication on multifunctional hedgerows. And then I think it was 2022, we updated that publication, and I can offer you that resource later on. So really, I've had, in order to be a permaculturalist, I've had a diverse way of creating my income. So I do teaching, land consulting, then design. I work with the nonprofit Salmon Safe. I also steward 7.5 acres here in Cottage Grove, Oregon, called Wilson Creek Gardens, and have plants and food that I trade and sell. I am just so grateful that I found this path because I loved it in the beginning and I still love it. And I feel like that is the answer. Permaculture is the answer for a way of life to create change and, guide people to care for the earth and care for people.
Well, and you're so well known in our community. I've just been dying to meet you for so long. I've heard such good things about your teacher training, and I'm hoping to attend that course someday. but hearing your a little bit about your history and your experience on Woodby Island, that's just really cool to me. Mary and I are at Preg Tree Farm in Arlington, so we're pretty close.
Yeah, it's right nearby.
I do know Preg Tree. I actually taught a women's workshop there many, many years ago, and I have fun stories from that time.
Oh, wow, that's so amazing. I'd love to hear more about that at some point. We'll have to have a Preg Tree call at some point in the future. Yeah, we love it. We've just been here for the last 2 years, but it's a really special place.
Yeah, we're just so inspired by your work, and I think that that's so incredible that you really framed it in a way where it is such an immersive thing, that it's not a separate career, it's not just a job, but that it's a lifestyle and that it's a whole concept to live by.
Yeah.
Yeah, so we are thrilled to dive into your area of expertise. I've just been like really excited to talk with you all about one of the things I love, which is hedgerows. So you're an expert in this space. Can you please explain what is a hedgerow, and can you share some of the history of this growing style?
Yes, that would be a great place to start. So hedgerows, it's an old English term that refers to a layered, narrow planting that grow along field borders, fence lines, waterways. And in the Northwest, this ancient design method is being expanded to incorporate a diverse number of plant species with a wide variety of functions. And that's the focus that I present to it. Most hedgerows are often designed just to be native plants. And my encouragement is to think about, what functional plants can be utilized to provide different areas of focus, which we'll talk about. So, the plants that I like to see in hedges are trees, shrubs, ground covers, perennials, annuals, vines. Everything that we talk about today will be site dependent relative to, what is your environment, where are you located, and, whether it's a suburban area or rural area. And we can fit in the way that we can design those in each type of location. So it depends on the function, the size, and the location. So to think about that hedges are diverse plantings with multiple benefits. And, one of the key functions that I think about is, especially along waterways, they shade the water to create more cooling environments for the aquatics. They offer wildlife habitat, encourage beneficial insects, reduce soil erosion, provide bank stabilization, uptake nutrients and pollutants, and they're also shelter belts, windbreaks, and screen for privacy. And one of the things that I like to include in hedgerows is a way to create some sort of income, and especially working with farmers, creating some income diversity, because farmers are always looking for more ways to make money. And so that in the rural environment, or even in the suburban or urban environment, planting herbs that one could be selling at market or trading with people is another, really awesome opportunity. So that's a little about, what hedgerows are. And there has been lots of research, especially through ATTRA, which is ATTRA, Sustainable Agriculture Program. They are an amazing resource for all things ag-related, and that the research now is really coming out how important hedgerows are to improve biodiversity and water quality. And there's a lot of research with that, though there's limited research on the income producing potential of these sites. So that, again, is one of the things that I'm working on and will be addressing in the book that I'm in the process of working on.
Yeah, that's incredible. I love that you are including the ethical income and how you can have productive systems that will make farmers money. I think that that's huge within permaculture. You have such a wealth of knowledge when it comes to hedgerows. Where did your passion for hedgerows come from?
Well, it's interesting because I got involved with permaculture first, and then I started in some of the work that I was doing with farmers and thinking about, and especially with Salmon Safe and working with that program, is that part of what I do with them is work with more monocropped environments. Biodiversity is part of their standards. And so, where are you going to put biodiversity in monocropped environments? And so that's along the edges. That could be like I work with hops growers, and that could be under guide wires. So the idea of hedgerows really started coming more into my interest during that time, and that it just has developed over time to really be an important part of the design process.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, that's huge.
So if we look back on your experience in this space, are there any specific hedgerows that pop out and come to mind that are like something that you saw and you're like, wow, this is an amazing system. I want to learn more about this?
I think for me, it's one of those, one of the main permaculture principles is observation. The more I observed the natural habitats of hedges along waterways and field borders, and even in the urban suburban environment, looking at how people chose to plant to create more privacy, and then in my work realizing, how am I going to model that? And I am a total plant list geek. I have so many plant lists for every type of situation, whether deer tolerant, drought tolerant, bird attracting, beneficial insect attracting, shade, sun, just all of that. And so I am a person who researches extensively. So it's observation and research, talking with people about the types of plants that they like, and then putting those together with a location. So that's kind of, and then also I just thought I might mention a little bit about the history of hedges, because that is part of kind of what inspired me also. So there's evidence of hedgerows dating back to the Bronze and Iron Age, which is like 5,000 years ago, and also in the Roman times and the Saxon times, especially in the Saxon times, there was the idea of, hedges surrounding villages and field borders. And the early days, and even to this day, of course, hedges are really accidental creations. They're woodland strips marking, boundaries that, because especially along waterways, vegetation is always growing and usually in a linear fashion. And the original hedgerows were those linear thickets along stream banks, and a mix of native species. And so I think that the farmers must have been observing that as well, and they started utilizing the hedges for separating and sheltering livestock. And also back in the day, they were keeping marauders out. And in the beginning, the hedges were designed and planted by live stakes of hawthorn, and just stuck in the ground. And hawthorn, many of you might know, are very thorny. So that would keep the livestock in and unwanted out. And so the English really, they did hedges for so long, and that's really where a lot of the research has happened, because that has been recorded through history. In England, 50% of the land was forest, and what they would do is they would clear away the forest, leaving a small percentage, along the waterway, and then to create these, long, narrow plantings, those linear strips, and then they utilized the rest of the land for agriculture. And that's really been modeled a lot throughout history, everywhere, even up until this day. And so that's, kind of the history in England. Further back, though, in the 12th and 15th centuries, hedgerows were there. They called it an enclosure movement, where they were including hedges even more so in the farmlands. Wealthy landowners sort of got an idea around that, and so they formed this thing called in the 16th century, the Enclosure Act. And that really set the stage for creating over 6.8 million acres of hedges in England, with like 200,000 miles of hedges. It was just an amazing phenomenon. And that was all the wealthy landowners kind of set that into place. Well, in the 15th century, the commoners revolted, against this whole hedge enclosure. And so a lot of those hedges were starting to get torn out and utilized, and that whole movement was set aside. Though what's left, you see pictures of the patchworks of fields and hedges in England. Some of them are the remnants of those times. So that's kind of some of the history. And then in the 1940s, the English government decided that they wanted to remove a lot of hedges. Then, of course, what happened? But the negative consequences was there was loss of wildlife habitat, and that increased pest problems. So then there was more herbicides for clean farming, and that, of course, again, impacted biodiversity. And so, it just created this big uproar in England. And so then in 1989, the government started giving farmers incentives to replant hedgerows. And that's been happening ever since. So that's sort of a little bit of history in England. And then in the research that I was doing, there's a book called The Great Hedge of India. And this was in the 19th century. And the British planted the British didn't plant it, the Indian people planted 2,300 miles of hedge. And they were hoping that hedge would be a border, which would assist in tax collection. Well, that thing totally failed. So, but again, it's an interesting book to see about the importance of hedges, even in that kind of environment. So then let's move to North America, where most of our listeners are based. And there was a very limited hedgerow tradition, though in the golden age of the 1930s and 40s in the US and Canada, windbreaks became much more utilized especially because of all the strong winds in the Midwest. And so there was lots of tree planting to combat soil erosion. Though in the late 50s, a lot of those hedgerows were starting to get removed, and because the farmers wanted fence row to fence row farming. And again, that destroyed so much of the biodiversity and habitat for all those wonderful beneficial insects, which of course then led to lots of herbicide use. And so that's a bit of the backstory of hedgerows in England and even in Africa. They were using dead hedges in dry areas for livestock control, which they still are using. So you see a lot of the use of this narrow plantings or structures for particular functions. And my goal is to bring back the hedgerow with a focus on the multifunctional approach. So that's where I guess my passion is relative to hedges.
Yes. Yeah. So awesome to think about the historical context and how that informs so much of the work that you're doing now, and so much of the work that we're doing as designers, trying to replicate these historic systems in modern time.
Especially as a land steward and helping other people with their design projects. Say I'm a new land steward or a designer that wants to design a hedgerow. Where does one start? What are the basics of designing a successful hedgerow system?
Well, I thought maybe what we would do is just give an example of a hedge that I have co-designed. I always think I'm always co-designing with whoever I'm working with, the person who's working the land, because it's a mutual engagement of that process. And I figure the more a person is involved, the more they're going to understand really the care and maintenance of the site that we're working on. So we're going to use an example of multi-crop community-supported agriculture, the CSA, on 150 acres in the Willamette Valley. And they requested a hedgerow along a river tributary, and their goal was to encourage beneficial insects and just include a wide variety of farm biodiversity as well as some crop production. And they're a multi-species, predominantly annual crops, so they have a lot of berries as well. There was 4 partners on this particular farm, and I worked with mostly just one of them. But the partners decided where they were going to, what was the location of the hedgerow. And they also were talking about the plants that they wanted to include as well. So this was, they decided on an area that was next to this waterway, really in a riparian zone. And then that's one side. On the other side, there was pasture. At the time, there were 60 beef cows grazing there. And the goal was to design a project to demonstrate a win-win situation for farmers along a waterway, because that is one of the places that hedges are so needed. And then the other part is a planting mix as a combination of native, non-native, non-invasive plants with the potential for income sources. So that was part of the goal. As other parts were to improve water quality along this waterway, as well as, like I said, income production, just to create a demonstration project. And so I was working with farmers. We determined the non-invasive plant species that thrive in riparian zones because there was standing water there for no more than 4 days, but we needed to take that into consideration. And again, thinking about what sort of income they could be producing. And so I came up with about 25 plants that I thought would work well in that particular environment. And they just chose 10. So I thought that was, I think that was a good reality check, is to thinking about in this situation, kind of starting small and then expanding on that, because the hedge was actually 35 feet wide and 275 feet long. And one of my favorite permaculture principles is start small, have success, then use maybe the template from which you're working with to like design another one. So you figure, even if somebody's in an urban or suburban area, they might just do a hedge that's 4 feet by 10 feet and, see how that works, and then duplicate that to, again, another 4 feet by 10 feet, so that all of a sudden they might want a 30-foot hedge, yet they're not maybe as familiar with gardening or with plants. And so start small and have success, and then that will inspire people to work more. And I think of, as I'm going through this, it's, again, I feel like I'll be describing a bit of a template. That sort of, that was the intent of this particular hedgerow. The other part is, they wanted to have a long-term, or we decided it was very important to have a long-term monitoring plan for easy assessment, also to determine the effectiveness and viability of the plant choices and location. They also wanted to have the hedge open to the public by appointment, because this particular farm was very, very community-based. And so that's one of the reasons I'm choosing this particular place, because they decided it was going to be a demonstration site, and that, of course, was inspiring to me to be able to think about more farmers. They have lots of open farm days as well, and so that was another goal of theirs. And the reason I'm talking about this particular hedge is this has been planted for a very long time, and I've gone back there over time and observed what's working and what's not working. So with this particular design, we maintain about a 10-foot filter strip between the waterway and the main planting area. So that would be a mow strip, because you have to think about maintenance as we do this. And in this situation, they wanted to be able to get between these 5 rows that we layered so that they could mow easily, to keep the grasses away, pasture grasses away from the main planting. So they did that, and then they also fenced in the other side of the hedgerow from the cows, and also, to keep the plants more protected. One thing about this particular farm is that it is deer fenced. Part of it is deer fenced, so we didn't have to worry about that. Though challenges on the site, there was beaver, of course, if you're going to be along waterways. There was nutria, there were moles, mice, voles, deer. Even though there was a deer fence, it didn't work all the time. And so we had to protect the new little plants from these critters, and as well as from the invasive grasses and blackberries that were a part of that system. So that was part of the design. And that created quite an interesting project. So this particular site was funded by there was a watershed council, there was the local soil and water district, NRCS, Natural Resource and Conservation Service. So that was, it was awesome to get funding because they knew this was not only native plants. And that is sometimes hard to get funding for hedges that have any plants besides natives. And so I was, it was great to be able to have that as an opportunity.
Yeah, that's such a huge part of this is finding ways to make these projects happen. And there's so many programs out there.
Yeah, no, it's super cool to hear you mention NRCS. We have an NRCS field advisor coming out to Frag Tree Farm this Wednesday. And it's my friend Rebecca, who works for NRCS. And we're actually going to be interviewing her soon on the podcast to talk all about funding opportunities for projects like this. So I'm really grateful you brought that up. And I was curious, is the Conservation District also involved? Because here we have, in Snohomish County, we have a big push for working buffers, which is essentially like, instead of just native plants and conservation, we're working with farmers to implement these working buffers that protect and clean the water, and it's part of the Salmon Safe initiatives, but they want to work with farmers to have more like profitable income streams in those buffers. But I was just curious, do you do collaborations with the conservation districts in your area?
Yes, absolutely. And the watershed councils are awesome. Though the watershed councils, they tend to just want native plants. For me, it's like, just get plants in the ground, and have them be of service, basically. Yeah, I think that's a really good opportunity for thinking about funding.
Yeah.
Great resources there. You said something that really stood out to me that I loved was this concept of co-designing on these sites with these land stewards that you're working for. I was really glad to hear you say that, because designing is only going to be successful when we think about working as a collective
and communicating those maintenance plans and when to and how to assess in order to move forward.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, every time I do a design, I will offer up a booklet that has all the plants. So the numbers are on the map, and then they get a book basically about every plant with about 15 characteristics. The botanical name, the common name, when it blooms, how to take care of it, just a bunch of information, because people can go through this design process and then they can do the planting. Then, how do they maintain it, I think is just such an important part of the whole system.
Yeah, you're working to set people up for long-term success. And that sounds like such an important tool that, as a permaculture designer running our business, Mary and I'll keep that in mind moving forward, because we do plant lists, but we don't go into detail like that. But that's something that we should definitely consider for future projects, as far as like that teaching tool, really diving into the plant information.
Well, and there's no copy and paste for every site, because there's such a huge diversity of sites and different challenges that you might encounter with each site. Have you noticed any examples of a hedgerow project that was super challenging, or do you have a project that was kind of more difficult?
I think that the one I was describing, and I described the challenges with that, and I just thought I would kind of go through about the installation of a project like that. And we hired a local group of young people from a high school that were doing the planting. And it was the first gorgeous day in March. It'd been raining, and that was gorgeous. And here we had, 10 young people out there, and it was kind of hard to keep them focused instead of just laying in the sun. But that was kind of a good learning for me. But anyway, so we used a local resource. And what I realized that I had to do was we had to enclose each plant with wire. And I found some 4-foot length hardware cloth. You know what that is? Hardware cloth. It's like 1/2 inch by 1/2 inch, or like rabbit cages are made of that, and different type of cages. And so you can buy rolls of that. I went to a welder, and he actually cut this 4-foot length and to a 3-foot section and then a 1-foot section. The 1-foot section was underneath the ground to keep the mice away, and the 3-foot section was on the top to keep the beaver away and the deer and all of that. It's expensive and it worked. I'll tell you that all that we did to get these plants protected, we did not lose one plant. So it's really important, as we all know, to make sure that we do our install in a way that is going to be effective over time. So we removed the sod. This particular farmer did not want to have newspaper or cardboard. He wanted to use landscape cloth. I'm not a huge fan of that, though we made a 3-foot square, and we marked that with flags originally. And then, people went and they removed the sod, the pasture grass from that area, dug a hole, and then put in the 1-foot wire cage and close that up. And then we put the landscape cloth over the top of that, and then, put a hole in there, and then planted the tree or the shrub. And then we enclosed the top part with the 3-foot section and used rebar to hold that wire solid. And then we also just used a few wires to attach the 1-foot section and the 3-foot section. So that way it was very difficult for a beaver to lift off the wire, because that's really, like I said, that's one of the biggest challenges. The soil was really good quality, so we didn't have to worry about a lot of soil preparation. And I'm not a super fan of putting a lot of fertilizers in this kind of environment, because I want the plants to be situated and comfortable in the native soil. So if if you're putting in a bunch of fertilizer, they're only, they're looking for the fertilizer sometimes, and they're not going to grow out of their hole as much. So anyway, that's one of the things that I tend to, in that environment, especially when the soil is so good. We also did some trunk protectors so that the grazing, there wouldn't be any critters, especially the voles, like to eat the bark. And so they're called trunk protectors. And what I did is I actually found some perf pipe that was a solid perf pipe, and we just cut that into 1-foot lengths and then put them around each plant. That was about the way we had it. We made it happen, and we put the sod around the sides of it. So we created like this reservoir, and then we watered everything very deeply. So that was how we created and did the install on this particular project. And the plants that they chose was aronia, the chokeberry, and they wanted it for jams and juice and wine. It's a very high antioxidant. The Elaeagnus multiflora, gumi, again, edible fruit, bird attracting. We put some sea hippophae in, the sea berry, and a few persimmon. Of course, delicious eating. They're fabulous dried. Some blue elderberry, again, high, rich in vitamins, and we tried some northern pecans. They did not make it, so we weren't really sure. We did put some chestnuts in, a few heart nuts. In the lower story, we just seeded out some wildflower mix, just to create and to bring in some more of those beneficial insects. So this was predominantly, as you can tell, this was all food plants that they could harvest. Elderberries, especially in this region, are really a valued crop, as well as the persimmon. And persimmon can handle a few days of wet when the river flooded. So that just gives you an example of that process. So really, when you think about, I think you asked me about challenging situations. Challenges often are the critters that want to come in and eat the plants or the crop, as well as maintenance. Not taking care of it properly is often a big challenge. Or people get really excited, but yet they don't water. And really, I believe, at least in our area, and of course it depends always on where you're located, you need to make sure that the plants are watered for the first 2 or 3 years. And even if they're native plants, they're not going to survive well in our area where it's droughty all summer long. If you're in an area where you get summer rains, no problem. that is definitely something that needs to be taken into consideration.
Yeah, so it sounds like there was a long list of extreme challenges here, from maintenance and irrigation and the critters. I heard a lot about the beaver, and I'm curious, can you speak to, do you have like a love-hate relationship with beavers, or what's that like?
It's fun to have visitors, and they're very cute.
Well, the beavers were here before us, so, I choose to honor them. That's why we went to such great lengths to protect the trees in the way we did with hardware cloth. I have seen hedgerows and plantings done along waterways that they use chicken wire, and that doesn't last. They rust really quickly. They're so able to get to that sweet mark that they are wanting to get and bring down trees. I've seen, hazels, all these newly planted hazels, and they've just all been destroyed because the beaver just take them out. So I think that, it's just something that one needs to be mindful of and protect against them. Yeah.
Is the goal to eventually have this hedgerow be providing habitat and food for the beaver? What's the long-term plan for these animals in this space that you're protecting the plants from at first? What's the future hold for that space?
Yeah, and I was curious if these installations, the fabric and the cages, if those are phased out at a certain point.
Well, the fabric is really tended to decompose. What has been needed to happen is that the wire cages, have to be loosened over time. Though if you take them off, the beaver will come. Like, do you want to have a hedgerow, or do you want the beaver to take over that particular area, or those critters to take over that area? What I'm really wanting to encourage is bird attracting, beneficial attracting, the smaller critters. I'm not really wanting to encourage the bigger critters that are going to take down the hedgerow, basically, because that's not really one of the functions, because generally there are, enough food elsewhere for these other critters. The listeners might, be in a more suburban environment. And, when you think about preparing soil for a hedge in the urban environment, oftentimes one would think about deciding where you want to put your hedgerow, and then putting cardboard down in the fall, and then covering it with leaves. I always like to put a manure source or a nitrogen source down before I put the cardboard down, and that encourages the worms to come and do their great work. And then put the cardboard down, the leaves down, and then you could plant in the spring. And you can just cut holes in the cardboard if it's not totally, it's usually really wet, and then put your plants in at that time. The other thing that one can do, and again, it's site dependent. If your soil doesn't get warm until May, you're in an area where, it's very cold and your ground is frozen. Of course, you're going to have to schedule your soil prep and everything relative to that. The other thing is the potential for putting in, like in the fall, one could, even in a farm environment, which is really what I recommend. If you, the situation I described to you, we did not do this, but I usually prefer to have that area tilled and then put a cover crop in, let that grow up really well. In the springtime, till again, let the weed seeds come up and grow, and then till again, and then plant a cover crop. And then the following fall, again, depending on where the site is, plant your hedgerow. And in that way, the seed bank is diminished to a certain degree. In a suburban environment, urban environment, one can do something similar to, I'm not a big fan of tilling, though in large scale, it makes sense to me. Smaller scale, again, doing lasagna method, or, just a simple covering with leaves, cardboard. Though, some people like to till, so you till it all up, and you could do something similar and plant in the spring. But I love the idea of preparing the soil first, planting a cover crop, feeding that soil, and making a really nice bed for the hedgerow to start thriving in.
Thank you for such a detailed description of all of that. Something that I really appreciate is how much you've touched on the different environments and different situations that people might be in where they're planting. One of those being conventional farmers. I'm just curious, what has it been like working with conventional farmers to implement these regenerative practices? How do you go about viewing large-scale agriculture through a permaculture lens?
Oh, that's the beauty of permaculture. You can apply the principles and the strategies to any environment anywhere in the world. It's the techniques that are different. You know, with conventional farmers, the goal is to reduce the harder chemistries that are applied and think about softer chemistries. I don't work totally with organic farmers, so it's, you know, I have learned to be more flexible and to encourage practices that are more gentle on the earth. And so, you know, again, it's a similar process. It's like, okay, they're wanting to bring in, and more conventional farmers I have observed are leaning towards more sustainable practices, I guess it might be the right word. And the other thing that I'm observing over time is that the younger generation of farmers, where their families, their fathers and their grandfathers and mothers and great-grandfathers, they were all conventional, and younger farmers are thinking more into more organic methods and easier on the land methods. And that is definitely, it's creating some hope for me when I think about the farming situations. So yeah, I think that it's always like being out in the field and doing some keen observation and going, yeah, along this way you could put a hedge and this would provide, you know, all these different potential functions as I described before. I feel like the approach is one of not being accusatory. It's just being explaining the benefits and why it's so important, and why would a farmer invest their time and money into a project like this? And when you think about the amount of herbicides, and insecticides that are put on the land, and what I've observed over time since I've been working in this for quite some time is that there is less of a need to put on expensive chemicals. And when you're talking with farmers, money talks. So that makes a big difference.
Awesome.
I just wanted to mention some of the products that can be grown when we talk about different income production. So nuts, fruits, berries, medicinal herbs, their leaves, flowers, seeds, bark, and roots, seed collection, nursery stock, mushrooms, flowers, floral, greenery, craft material, some wood products. So these are some of the other options for income production, just to mention that as well.
So many opportunities for diversifying yields within hedgerows. And I so badly want to just dive so deep into just the plant world with you at some point in the future. Like, we could do an entire session and we could just talk plants for forever.
Yeah, there is regenerative living is recording a 6-week course that I'm currently doing, and it will be self-paced after this. So if people want to learn more, there's a whole slideshows and much more detail on that, and also a guide to hedgerows. The Oregon State University EM 87212, I believe, is the publication number. Again, that goes into a long list of plants that would work in a hedgerow.
Yeah, excellent. We will definitely check out those resources and so many of the others that you've shared throughout the session. We'll link in the show notes. So you've got the Permaculture Educator's Guidebook, and you've got a book on hedgerows. Can you share a little bit about those and what's going to be in those books and when we can expect those to be available?
Oh, the hedgerow I started in 2000, and I have so much information. I just have not allocated the time. Though it's getting closer all the time, but right now I'm working on the educator's guide because I've been doing this teacher training, and I realized I wanted to have a companion book to work that people could utilize as part of that class and that course, as well as just an independent book. And goes through a lot of really everything that I cover in a teacher training, from the idea of building curriculum, lesson plans, facilitation, it just the whole gamut of what it is that we talk about in a teacher training. So those are the two books that I'm working on, and I'm going to finish the guidebook hopefully within the next 2 months. And I have an upcoming teacher training happening in Cottage Grove, which is on June 16th to the 22nd. And so I invite people to come if they want to share this valuable information with others. And the teacher training is not about teaching permaculture design courses. It's just about teaching anyone, anywhere. There's a lot of people who are educators who are taking the course and teaching at the university or in public schools. There's farmers taking it, designers, people who want to change their careers. So that is a resource that is out there if people are interested. And I also wanted to mention that I have an extensive bibliography on my website where people can look at all permaculture types of books, and it's annotated, so it kind of gives people an idea. And of course, in that as well is a lot of books on plants and hedgerows and lots of other parts of the permaculture world.
Perfect. I know so many of our listeners are going to be thrilled to grab your books as soon as they're available. Do you have a newsletter where you'll send out updates on when those are available?
I do. On my website, cascadiapermaculture.com, there's a way to sign up for my newsletter.
Amazing. So this has been such a phenomenal experience on my end. I feel like I have learned so much. So we're actually working on a design project right now, and I'm going to go, take so much of the lessons I learned here and apply that to this design project.
And do a deep dive within the resources that you mentioned. Those sound incredibly helpful.
Absolutely. And so do you have any closing thoughts for us today from this session? Any sort of words of wisdom you can share with our listeners? Any final thoughts?
For me, it is all about getting the work done. It's just like going out there, being brave, whether you're teaching this information or whether you're being a designer or whether you're, a home gardener and want to actualize what we've talked about. It really is about doing the work on the ground and making change. And that's what I support is, a lot of people take PDCs, permaculture design courses, and they're not exactly sure what to do next. And I think that it is a little challenging for people to get out there and they don't know where to start. And my recommendation is think about, there's so many topics that are covered in permaculture. What are one or two topics that really excite you and that you want to learn more about, and work with people in that particular field and get on the ground experience, and that way that might lead to a new career for you. And I love the term right livelihood, and that's really what we're talking about in permaculture is making a living in an area where we are we hold an ethical base that we can create the change that is so needed here on the planet.
Yeah, your story and your career is just so inspiring. And I just appreciate you coming on the pod today and sharing with us about your knowledge and where your passions have come from. So thank you for joining us.
Yeah, Jude, I'll echo what Mary just said. It is so great to get to connect with you. And I know our listeners are going to be thrilled to learn from you. This has been an absolute pleasure to get to have this talk today.
Thank you so much. It's been lovely chatting with you as well.
Please come visit us at Preg Tree. I just oh my gosh, I'm so excited to know that you've been here because it's barely anyone's heard of Preg Tree Farm. So to hear that you've not only been here, but you've taught a class here, I just want to hear all about that. So maybe let's talk about that again soon.
Yeah, we want to hear your stories.
I always have a lot of stories.
Well, excellent. Yeah. Well, thank you again. And thank you to Scott Mann for bringing us together. And we appreciate all of you listening.
All right. Thanks a lot for thinking of me. Bye.
And that was Jude Hobbs. You'll find links to Jude, including her website, cascadiapermaculture.com, and other resources in the show notes. There are also additional links to Jude and her work from the archives of the Permaculture Podcast. I feel fortunate my first introduction to Jude, when she was a listener and fan of the Permaculture podcast, all the way back in 2010, the halcyon days of the show, when she was one of those first few dozen subscribers. The following year, I attended her teacher training in Oregon. Across the intervening decade, I've joined her as a guest instructor at a course she taught in Brooklyn, New York, and we've been on panels with one another at other classes. I say this so that you understand that I've known Jude through these years and continue to share space with her beyond just the podcast. I feel fortunate to know her and to count her as one of my most influential mentors. If you're someone looking to make your journey, knowledge, and understanding of permaculture deeper and more rewarding, as a parent, member of your community, or a professional instructor offering your own PDCs, I highly recommend taking time to seek out Jude. If she's going to be in your area offering a lecture or a class, definitely attend if you're able to. Or, if you've already taken a permaculture design class, take a teacher training at her beautiful site near Eugene, Oregon, Wilson Creek Gardens. I had a wonderful time there and have found that knowing Jude and studying with her were life-changing experiences, and think you will too if you seek out this opportunity. If you have thoughts or questions on this interview, including how Mary and Andrew did as hosts of the show, get in touch. Give me a call, 717-827-6266, email show@thepermaculturepodcast.com. You can also reach me electronically by visiting thepermaculturepodcast.com, clicking on Contact, and sending me a direct message. If you prefer, you can also drop something in the mail. That address is The Permaculture Podcast, P.O. Box 2509, Falls Church, Virginia, 22042. If you do choose to send me something, be sure to include your mailing address, and I'll send you a handwritten note from my extensive collection of postcards. Listen for another new interview from Mary and Andrew, where they talk with Andrew Millison and his work and journeys as a content creator and educator, out in a few weeks. Until then, spend each day expanding your knowledge and deepening your understanding of permaculture while taking care of Earth, yourself, and each other. This episode of the Permaculture Podcast is a collaboration between Permaneo Group, LLC, and Edge Perma. Find out more about our other projects at permaneogroup.com and edgeperma.com.